Good morning, sixth grade. Yesterday we worked on Chapter 5, Lesson 1. Today we're going to go ahead and move on to Chapter 5, Lesson 2. You should have already watched the video that went along with this. So we'll go ahead and get started with Life in Ancient Egypt.
Lesson 2. Life in Ancient Egypt. It matters because the Egyptian pharaohs were all powerful rulers. Egyptians built such gigantic and sturdy pyramids in their honor that the pyramids still stand today. Egypt's early rulers. Guiding question. How was ancient Egypt governed? Around 2600 BC, Egyptian civilization entered the period known as the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom lasted until about 2200 BC. During these years, the Egyptians built magnificent cities and increased trade. They also formed a unified government. The Egyptians prized unity. They understood the importance of everyone working and living according to similar principles and beliefs. Therefore, they developed a government under an all-powerful ruler who controlled both religious and political affairs. A government in which the same person is both the political leader and the religious leader is called a theocracy. A political leader. At first, the Egyptian ruler was called a king. Later, he was known as Pharaoh. The word Pharaoh originally meant great house. It referred to the grand palace in which the king and his family lived. The Egyptians were fiercely loyal to the pharaoh because they believed that a strong ruler unified their kingdom. The pharaoh held total power. He issued commands that had to be obeyed. Egyptians believed that a pharaoh's wise and far-reaching leadership would help their kingdom survive such disasters as war and famine. The pharaoh appointed bureaucrats or government officials to carry out his orders. Bureaucrats supervised the construction and repair of dams, irrigation canals, and brick granaries. Granaries were used to store grain from bountiful harvests so people would not starve during times of poor harvests. The pharaoh owned all the land in Egypt and could use it as he pleased. The pharaoh's officials collected tax payments of grain from farmers. The pharaoh also distributed land to officials, priests, and wealthy Egyptians whom he favored. A religious leader. Egyptians were also loyal to the pharaoh because they thought he was the son of Re, the Egyptian sun god. They believed their pharaoh was a god on earth who protected Egypt. Whenever the pharaoh appeared in public, people played music on flutes and cymbals and bowed their heads. As Egypt's religious leader, the pharaoh participated in ceremonies to help the kingdom thrive. For example, the pharaoh rode a bull around Memphis because the Egyptians believed that this would help keep the soil fertile. The pharaoh was also the first person to cut the ripened grain at harvest time. Egyptians believed this action would produce abundant crops. Religion in Egypt. Guiding question. What kind of religion did the ancient Egyptians practice? Religion influenced every aspect of Egyptian life. Like the people of Mesopotamia, ancient Egyptians worshipped many gods and goddesses. The people of Egypt, however, thought their gods were more powerful. The Egyptians believed these deities controlled natural forces as well as human activities. The Egyptians depended on the sun to grow their crops and on the Nile River to make the soil fertile. Thus, two of the most crucial gods were the sun god Re and the river god Hapi. Another important god was Osiris. According to legend, Osiris was an early pharaoh who gave the Egyptian people laws and taught them farming. His wife, Isis, represented the faithful wife and mother. Osiris and Isis together ruled over the world of the dead. Thoth was the god of learning. He could take human or animal form, or both, as did most gods and goddesses. The afterlife. The Egyptians had a positive view of the afterlife. They believed that life after death would be even better than the present life. After a long journey, the dead arrived at a place of peace. One of the most important writings of ancient Egypt was the Book of the Dead. Egyptians studied its prayers and magic spells to prepare for the afterlife. They believed that Osiris greeted those who had just died at the gate to the next world. If people had led good lives and knew the spells, Osiris would give them eternal life. This passage from the Book of the Dead explains what a person who enters the happy afterlife can expect. Primary source: wheat and barley shall be given unto him therein, and he shall flourish there, just as he did upon earth. From Papyrus of Ani, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The earliest Egyptians believed that only the pharaohs could enjoy the afterlife. They thought that the pharaoh's soul resided in his body, and that the body had to be protected in order for the soul to complete the journey to the afterlife. There, the pharaoh would continue to protect Egypt. If the pharaoh's body decayed after death, his soul would not have a place to live. The pharaoh would not survive in the afterlife. As the centuries passed, however, Egyptians came to believe that the afterlife was not only for pharaohs. All people, rich and poor, could hope for eternal life with the help of the god Osiris. As a result, the process of embalming emerged so that Egyptians could protect bodies for the afterlife. Before a body was embalmed, priests removed the body's organs. The organs were stored in special jars that were buried with the body. Then the priests covered the body with a salt called natron and stored it for several days. The natron dried up the water in the body, causing it to shrink. The shrunken, dried body was then filled with burial spices and tightly wrapped with long strips of linen. The wrapped body was then known as a mummy. The mummy was sealed in a coffin and placed in a decorated tomb. Wealthy people had their mummies placed in coffins and buried in tombs. Poorer people had their mummies buried in caves or in the sand. Even animals were embalmed. Egyptians viewed animals not only as pets, but also as sacred creatures. As a result, they buried the mummies of cats, birds, and other animals at temples honoring their gods and goddesses. Medical skills. The Egyptians learned much about the human body from embalming. This knowledge helped them to develop basic medical skills. Egyptian doctors sewed up cuts and set broken bones. They were the first to use splints, bandages, and compresses. Egyptians also wrote down medical information on papyrus scrolls. These records were the world's first medical books. Progress check. Analyzing. Why did Egyptians protect a person's body after death? Pyramid tombs. Guiding question. Why and how were pyramids built? The Egyptians honored their pharaohs in a special way. They built great tombs, called pyramids, for the pharaohs. These enormous structures were made of stone and covered the area of several city blocks. Centuries after they were built, these monuments still tower over the desert sands. The pyramids protected the bodies of dead pharaohs from floods, wild animals, and robbers. The Egyptians believed the pharaohs would be happy after death if they had their personal belongings. For that reason, they placed the pharaoh's clothing, weapons, furniture, and jewelry in the pyramids.
Okay. And that kind of explains why we did that tomb project. Kind of shows you this is what they did with their items and why they wanted them in the tomb with them.
The pyramids preserved or saved these objects in relatively good condition for centuries. Today, archaeologists are able to study the pyramids and the treasures they hold to learn about life in ancient Egypt. How were the pyramids built? Thousands of workers spent years of hard labor to build the pyramids. Farmers did much of the work during the summer months when the Nile River flooded and they could not farm. Surveyors, engineers, carpenters, and stonecutters also helped build the pyramids. The first great engineer who built pyramids was Imhotep. He also served as an official for the pharaoh. Workers searched for stone in places throughout the Nile River Valley or in Upper Egypt. After locating the stone, skilled artisans used copper tools to cut the stone into huge blocks. Next, workers used rope to fasten the blocks onto wooden sleds. The sleds were pulled along a path made of logs to the Nile River. There, the stones were moved onto barges that carried them to the building site. Workers unloaded the blocks and dragged or pushed them up ramps to be set in place at each new level of the pyramid. The Egyptians faced many challenges as they built the pyramids. These challenges, however, led to important discoveries. For example, each pyramid rested on a square-shaped foundation with an entrance facing north. To find north, the Egyptians studied the skies and developed an understanding of astronomy. With this knowledge, they invented a 365-day calendar with 12 months divided into 3 seasons. This calendar became the basis for our modern calendar. Egyptians also made advancements in mathematics. Egypt's pyramid builders had to calculate how much stone was needed to build a pyramid. They had to measure angles in order to construct a pyramid's walls. To do this, they invented a system of written numbers based on 10. They also created fractions, using them with whole numbers to add, subtract, and divide. An Egyptian wonder. About the mid-2000s BC, the Egyptians built the biggest and grandest of the pyramids, the Great Pyramid. It lies about 10 miles, 16.1 kilometers, from the modern city of Cairo. Built for King Khufu, the Great Pyramid is one of 3 pyramids still standing at Giza on the Nile's west bank. It is about the height of a 48-story building, towering nearly 500 feet, 153 meters above the desert. It extends over an area equal in size to 9 football fields. More than 2 million stone blocks were used in the pyramid's construction, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons, 2.3 metric tons. For more than 4,000 years, the Great Pyramid stood as the tallest structure in the world. Progress check. Explaining. Why did the Egyptians build the pyramids? Daily life. Guiding question. How was Egyptian society organized? At its peak, ancient Egypt was home to about 5 million people. This would be about equal to the number of people living today in the state of Colorado. Most ancient Egyptians lived in the fertile Nile Valley and Delta. The delta is found at the mouth of the river. These 2 areas, which make up only 3% of Egypt's land, are densely populated even today. Egypt's social groups. The roles of the people in ancient Egypt reflected their social status or position in society. Look at the diagram of the different social groups or classes in ancient Egypt. The king or pharaoh and his family held the highest social position in Egypt, followed by a small upper class of army commanders, nobles, and priests. The priests served as government officials and supervised people who worked as clerks and scribes. A larger group of traders, artisans, and scribes made up the middle class. The lowest but largest groups in Egyptian society were made up of farmers and unskilled workers. Even though there were divisions in Egyptian class structures, ambitious people in the lower classes were able to improve their social position.
Okay, so let's take a closer look at the pyramid they were speaking of. So the social statuses in ancient Egypt. I'm going to open this up. There we go. So again, They reiterate there's Pharaoh at the top, then there's the upper class, the middle class, the farmers, and then the unskilled workers.
How people lived. Egypt's upper class lived in elegant homes and on estates along the Nile River. Their homes were constructed of wood and sun-dried mud bricks, and some were 2 or 3 stories tall. Surrounding their homes were lush gardens and pools filled with fish and water lilies. Men and women from the upper class dressed in fashionable white linen clothes and wore dark eye makeup and jewelry. Servants waited on them and performed household tasks. The middle class of ancient Egyptian society was made up of people who owned businesses and held skilled jobs. These jobs included trading and working as a scribe. Artisans were also important members of the middle class. These craft makers produced linen cloth, jewelry, pottery, and metal goods. The middle class lived in smaller homes and dressed more simply than the upper class. The largest Egyptian social classes included farmers, unskilled workers, and enslaved people. Most farmers worked on land that was owned by wealthy nobles. They paid rent to the landowners, usually with a portion of their crops. Farmers lived in houses that were made of mud brick. The houses generally had only one room and a roof made of palm leaves. Farmers ate a simple diet of bread, vegetables, and fruit. Unskilled workers performed manual labor, such as unloading cargo from boats and transporting it to markets. Some were fishers. Most unskilled workers settled in crowded city neighborhoods. They lived in small mud brick houses with hard-packed dirt floors. Their houses sometimes included a courtyard. Families often gathered on the flat rooftops to socialize, play games, and sleep. Because of the hot Egyptian climate, they also did their cooking on the rooftop. This helped their homes stay cooler. Some of these unskilled workers were enslaved people. Many of them had been captured in war, and they could earn their freedom over time. Some of these enslaved people helped build the pyramids. Egyptian families. The family was the most important group in ancient Egyptian society. Even the gods and goddesses were arranged in family groupings. The father was the head of the family in ancient Egypt, but women had more rights than women in other earlier civilizations had. Egyptian women held a legal status similar to that of men. They could own property, buy and sell goods, and obtain divorces. Wealthy women even served as priests, managing temples and performing religious ceremonies. Wives of farmers often worked in the fields with their husbands. Women of the higher social classes were more likely to stay at home, while their husbands worked at their jobs. Few Egyptian children attended school. Egyptian children had time for fun, playing with board games, dolls, spinning tops, and stuffed leather balls. As in many other cultures, Egyptian children were expected to respect their parents. Mothers taught their daughters to sew, cook, and run a household. Boys learned farming or other trades from their fathers. Learning their father's trade was important because very often the oldest son would inherit his father's business. When boys and girls became teenagers, they were expected to get married and start families of their own. In Egyptian cities and among the upper class, people usually lived in nuclear families. A nuclear family is made up of 2 parents and their children. Some farm families and others in the lower class lived as extended families. In an extended family, older adults, along with their married children and their families, lived together. For farm families, this provided more people to work the fields. The oldest son and sometimes the oldest daughter were also responsible for taking care of their parents when the parents became too old or sick to take care of themselves. This responsibility included making sure the parents were given a proper burial after they died. Progress check. Identifying. What types of people made up Egypt's upper class?